All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully, you can hear us on your end. It looks like we're seeing some of you join us now. So I will just start by introducing myself. So my name is Drew Kono. I am the Director of Communications and LGBTQ programs at the Religious Institute. And I am really excited to welcome you to this webinar today. So we have a really exciting conversation planned for you. It is going to be focused around what camp counselors, specifically camp counselors at religiously based camps, need to know about sexual orientation and gender identity. So we know that we are in the midst of high camp season. And it's hot outside. The kids are going to camp, and all of those things are happening. And so I wanted to sort of start us out with a story, and we have some great panelists. You're seeing their faces. I'm going to get to introducing them, but I want to start with a story to kind of ground why we decided to do this webinar and why we think that this conversation is so important. Where does this webinar come from? So a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a colleague who is a queer pastor who said to me that this year he has to go to camp. And I was sort of taken aback because he's somebody who's been talking to me a lot about boundaries and saying no to things. And so I was like, why do you have to go to camp this year? And he said that he has to go to camp because this is the first year that an openly trans child will be attending camp. And that he, as someone who knows the young person and has gone through training about gender identity and expression, felt that he needed to be there in order to make sure that the child and that other counselors had someone who they could lean on and someone who has training. So I want to just start that as that's a very familiar experience that queer people have, that people who are in ministry or some sort of religious leadership have. And we're sort of in this position right now where a number of religious communities are accepting or affirming or welcoming, at least on paper. But many don't have the training to live out that in the life of their religious communities or their churches or mosques or temples. And often what happens, we've found at the Religious Institute, I've found personally, that the sort of emotional and embodied labor of making that welcome and acceptance real often falls on queer and trans people. So we at the Religious Institute believe that this should not be the case necessarily, that the whole of our faith communities should take responsibility for making that welcome and acceptance real, and should take responsibility in doing so to train themselves and to question their practices, to see how they can contribute, how we can contribute to a community where LGBTQ people and all of our intended identities are fully integrated parts of religious communities. And that means that queer and trans people can't be the only people doing the work of ensuring that queer and trans kids are safe at summer camps. What often happens is that what often happens too when the whole of the faith community takes up this work is that we find out that it's not just about queer and trans kids, but it's really about broadening our conversation for everyone. So having a more authentic, full, complex conversation about gender and sexuality, which have far too often been too anemic. So it's not only that we need to treat queer and trans people more justly, which we definitely do, but also that we need a more holistic ethic of gender and sexuality for all people in our faith communities. That we need more just practices and procedures, and that enacting those will actually benefit everyone and strengthen our community as a whole. So it's in that spirit that we're approaching this webinar, which again is focused on the context of religious camps and geared towards camp counselors. We will have sort of 3 sections of this conversation presented by each of our panelists, and then we will open up for questions and answers. If any point you have any questions that you would like to ask, you're welcome to submit those into the chat box, and those will be visible to me as well as to all of the presenters. And sort of without, I guess, further ado, there are no pressing questions or issues with the technology, if everyone can hear me, which hopefully you can. I'm going to start by introducing our presenters in the order that they will present. So first is Tanya Bass. Tanya is a certified sexuality educator at North Carolina Central University. With over 20 years of public health education experience, Tanya is considered a subject matter expert in the areas of minority health, pregnancy prevention, HIV/STDs, and reproductive and sexual health. She is an alumna of North Carolina Central University, or NCCU, particularly their Department of Public Health Education, where she has served as an adjunct instructor for the past 10 years. Currently, Tanya is the lead instructor for human sexuality. After Tanya presents, Katina Washington-Leapart, the Director of Programs for Reproductive Justice and Sexuality Education at the Religious Institute, will go next. Katina is a self-identified womanist queer labor for the Jesus Project. Katina combines her love for justice and education with her experience in pastoral care and chaplaincy and her work at the Religious Institute. Her passion is helping communities of faith be thoughtful, courageous, and responsible in the care of their minds, bodies, and spirits. And then lastly, Laurie Alford will present. Laurie is currently the Pilgrim Point Program Director at the Minnesota Conference of the United Church of Christ. Laurie is the primary on-site program staff at Pilgrim Point Program Camp throughout the camping season, providing spiritual leadership, program direction, and support for congregation and conference-sponsored camps and retreats. Laurie has a career goal of blending together her three passions: Pilgrim Point Camp, Our Whole Lives, which I'm sure you'll hear more about, and work as a therapist, as they represent the spiritual, relational, and healing arts she has been crafting for many years. So thank you to each of you for being willing to be a part of this conversation and to share the wisdom that you have with us as a group. And I will sort of let you, Tanya, take it from there.
Thank you, Drew. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And I'm excited and nervous about this, but I guess to start the conversation off is kind of looking at the basics so that we're all kind of on the same playing field, so to speak, and have a little understanding of like what all this means. And so what I really appreciated in the entry was the discussion of the person saying that they were going to camp so that they can be a support for individuals. And I think that's ultimately what it's all about. When I think about adolescence, and many of you probably have learned this or talked about it at some point, like this is a very challenging, potentially stage in the lives of young people. How they're going into adulthood, transitioning from their early childhood, late childhood, entering their teen years, and then, of course, early adulthood. So for me, the foundational pieces to think about are the stages of development that many people have heard of, and some may not, with Erik Erikson, and looking at what's happening at the age of, let's say, 5 through 13, and then maybe 13 to 21. And so for individuals, young people ages 5 to 13, they're still looking at what that stage is, what industry versus inferiority, and they're still trying to figure out what they're good at, who they are. And all of this is about identity development. And as they enter into those late teen years, and maybe where some of the campers are, at least in my experience with camp here, some of the camps in North Carolina, they're also looking at their identity in terms of becoming independent from their parents, also breaking from their peers, or even being strongly influenced by their peers at that stage. And so when we think about their sexual development, that's still a part of this growth and development as becoming individuals and understanding what their next steps for their future would be. So it can be challenging. And so I think it's really important as we look at sexual orientation And for me, I'll back up and say that I really look at this as the umbrella of like sexual identity. So that includes sexual orientation, that includes gender identity, as well as gender expression. And so with us looking at that from a holistic perspective, those things are a part of who we are sexually and our identity sexually, but they're so different. And oftentimes we've been socialized or unlearned, so to speak, of how separate those things are. So, for example, when we think about sexual orientation and identifying who a person is attracted to, young people begin to learn that at a very early age. They still may be in a stage of maybe confusion and still trying to figure out who they are and who they like. But orientation is really about attraction. And so I think we've also been schooled that there are only maybe 2 or 3 orientations, either heterosexual, gay, or bisexual. And so we kind of keep that in that frame as well. But I think youth today are definitely at a place where they're free to learn more about their orientation and free to find words or things to kind of like describe themselves, and even have people who identify in the same way as they do. And so I think at camp, that support is definitely necessary. And then when I think about gender identity, we have also been schooled in the binary and to conform to those genders, male and female. And I think young people today also are able to explore and learn more about gender identity and gender and the role of gender expression, and even not conforming to those binary or any gender label or even an orientation label. So I feel like at camp, we don't want to make any assumptions. And then what Drew offered about transitioning, although we use the term, and most of us have heard or said LGBTQ, understanding that the T is not an orientation, but it's related to gender, identity. And so I think as camp staff, having a basic understanding of the separation between orientation and gender identity and then gender expression often will allow for a safer space for them to be supportive of young people. I just had a conversation, I think it was yesterday, in one of the camps here, where there were some young people who are transitioning, meaning they're in the process of being more affirmed and affirming their lives into the gender that they know they were born into in their own identity. And so complications arose when staff weren't sure how to actually house them, how to support them. And granted, for people, if this is not your everyday life as a sexuality educator or someone who does this work, it can be challenging, can be confusing. But the biggest thing is that you have to work with the individuals, the young people, to ensure their safety. One of the other things I would like to offer is that during this time in camp, to not make assumptions. So going back to gender expression, if we think about the scale from masculinity to femininity, there's places in the middle. We're socialized to think what femininity means and what masculinity means. And I've had the joyful pleasure of working with young people who are like, none of that makes sense for me. Like, I don't even care. And how I wake up today, how I dress, how I present to the world really has nothing to do with that scale for me as it does for people who look at me and who want to place me in that box. So I think staff should not make assumptions based on kind of like the societal expectations of what masculine and feminine means, and being affirming in terms of using correct pronouns. And that's been challenging in some of our camps and some of our work too, but also being able to learn names, so that if that's a challenge for you, learn names, and maybe that will be an easier space for you to navigate in as camp counselors, trying to really learn what this is about. And then finally, thinking about the AIB model, that is something, and I think, Drew, you said I could share resources. Now, I'm not selling this. I make no money, but one of the good books at the Center for Sex Ed has 25 great lessons about sexual orientation. And this is one way where you don't have to buy a full-on textbook to learn about the AIB model, which is about attraction, identity and behavior. And not only might it be useful for counselors for them to learn for themselves, but it may even generate information so that they can be more supportive and affirming to students who are questioning or still in a confused state about their sexual identity. That's kind of like where I am now. I think youth, again, are embracing as well as challenging gender expression and sexual identity as a whole, and we just need to be prepared to support them. And I think what I just offered could be a base knowledge for that. And I'll stop there because I don't know what else to say until you ask questions.
Great, thanks. That's a really good place to get us started. Katina, do you want to take it from there?
Yes. Thanks, Tanya. That was a really great introduction and overview of all of the interesting things that young people and adolescents in particular are experiencing, going through. We've all been teenagers and young folks, tweens before, and so we know how interesting of a time that can be and how difficult really of a time it can be as well. And to not have support around you makes it an even more challenging space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection between faith and gender and sexuality for young people, and how this can show up or will show up in faith communities and in these camp settings in particular, and how sort of best practices about addressing this, both for parents and guardians as well as camp staff. I entered this work as a parent of a tween who is going to a faith-based camp this summer. And so she's going to several camps, but one of them is a faith-based camp, which would be a new one for her this summer. And so these are, of course, things that myself and my spouse are thinking about as we kind of launch her at almost 12 into a new space and where she will be, around new kids and learning and growing, and so and in a faith-based context. So these are definitely important topics to think about. One of the things that we are really clear about here at the Religious Institute when we talk about sex and sexuality, whether it's attraction or across the spectrum behavior, is that we want to make sure that people are not feeling shamed for their attractions and or for their behaviors, but specifically in this moment talking about attractions. So as Tanya already talked about, attraction is normal. This is part of the normal sort of behavioral and biological evolution that happens as you get older. But I think sometimes it can freak parents out because they don't, oh my God, my child is actually like growing up, and what does this mean? They like this person or that person, and is that going to translate into some sort of activity, behind that? And how do I kind of deal with my own stuff that's coming up? Even you could think you're as progressive as you want to, and then when it's your kid, you're like, okay, let me try to figure out what's going on here for me, what's coming up here for me. And what we want to try to say here, and this is how we approach our conversations related to clergy, related to boundaries and attraction, when we talk about with clergy about what happens if you're attracted to somebody in the congregation, like that's not abnormal. So let's say that here, and then let's figure out what to do about that. We want to say the same thing to young folks, that attraction is normal, to feel that you're something's going on with your body, and what does this mean? Or to have some questions about just the biological things and the physical changes that you're going through, that's normal. And so starting from a place of affirmation, I think is really helpful with young people, and particularly for those of us in faith communities where conversations about sex and sexuality and gender identity can feel almost taboo, to kind of subvert that. And to affirm for people like this is a part of who you are, a part of who the divine, parent, whether that's God or however you want to think about that, the divine creator made you to be. And there's nothing shameful or wrong about the feelings that you're having or about how your body is changing. And so I think that folks, religious institutions, so churches, congregations, faith-based camps, need to acknowledge this, that sex and sexuality and issues of sex and sexuality are real for young people, and to start from an affirmation place and not a shame or judgment place. The second thing is that we want to make sure, as we're talking about sex and sexuality, and this is the same thing that we talk about with adults, but adults inherently, we think, have a little bit more maturity related to the decisions that they are making with their own bodies, that kids, young people, haven't quite gotten there yet. They haven't had the life experience. They haven't had the psychological development. Is how do faith communities help young people think about ethical decision-making related to their sex and sexuality? You know, okay, so what do I do with these attractions, right? I'm having them, I'm not quite sure, I like this person or that person, I want to do maybe something. And so it's, you know, part of what we try to say is not an abstinence-only kind of model for that, but saying to young people, okay, here are the things that you need to take into consideration about making ethical decisions related to sex, to expressing your sex and sexuality, if you're talking about in a relational or more physical kind of way. And that is rooted in, from a faith community perspective, making sure that young people are being formed in spaces where they are taught to not only honor the sacredness and the divinity of their own bodies, but that of the other people that are around them, the people that they're in relationship with too. And so how do we think about how do faith communities help to educate young people about what that looks like in an age-appropriate fashion, such that as they're thinking about making those decisions, what are the ethics and morals that are being factored into that decision? I think that faith communities have a huge role here in walking alongside parents and guardians, as I mentioned just at the top of my remarks. Even for those of us who are sex educators or are in progressive faith spaces, it can still be a little nervous. You can be a little nervous about having to talk to your own kids about this, or kids that are in your life that you are in close relationship with. And so how can clergy and other folks help parents to deal with what's coming up for them, such that they can honestly and openly communicate with their kids about what is happening with them, about their bodies, about their attractions, and what to do or not do about that. And how can faith communities be spaces where people are openly talking about? I know that Laurie's going to talk a little bit about OWL, like what does it look like to be a faith community that is a place where programs like OWL and other conversations are open and honest and are happening, and it's the norm and not something that's abnormal. I think that, you know, as I close my comments here, and I know we'll talk a little bit more, I think that, you know, the key for me in this conversation, as we're thinking about what the role is, I think that this extends across the spectrum, across the whole lives of sexuality from birth to death, is an affirmation. I think that so much of how we talk about sex and sexuality and gender identity in faith communities is rooted in a lot of shame and secrecy. And I think that if we start our young people out from that space and place, that I think scatters seeds for them to continue to think about sex and sexuality in a shameful way, and that they're in some kind of punishment transactional relationship with their notion of God, and I don't think that leads to them making ethical decisions related to sex and sexuality. And so I think that these topics do come up, and I think when kids are away at camp and they're in a new environment, and perhaps they're with counselors or kids that are not necessarily from their church or from their faith community, you know, I think it would behoove camp spaces to really one, be thinking about this when they're training their counselors, and two, thinking about how to integrate this in a holistic way in the programming.
Great. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Laurie. Yeah.
That's all right. I think both Tanya, can you hear me? Okay, good. Both Cantina and Tanya made so many great points about camp being a time and a space where kids also come to kind of explore. And sometimes we don't know what that's going to look like. And I think we at the Minnesota Conference have come to the conclusion that single gendered housing doesn't fit the mold for everyone who is now coming to camp. And so we have to think differently about what that means when we're bringing young people into camp. So I have a couple of things I want to say about that, but the first thing I want to talk about is that staff piece. Training staff, helping them understand both healthy boundaries and some of the different ways in which kids will come in all their various ways in sexualities that they want to express. And sometimes they come to camp, especially in the Minnesota Conference. We are an open and affirming conference, so therefore our camp is open and affirming because we are a conference entity. Kids are coming to try on some new things at camp too, because of the way we've created our space. So we try to help our leadership understand that. We have a management agreement with a Lutheran camp across the way, and we have worked with their staff because their staff will be present with our young people to help them understand this wide variety in which campers will come, and how do we talk about pronouns, and how do we talk about what you might see as far as dress. I mean, the real very practicalities of what kids might be trying on while they're in our space. The next point that we really are working on for this year is having a better conversation around sexual behavior at camp too. We want camp to maintain this safety. It's a safe space, it's a sacred space, it's a space that everybody loves because we've been able to create that and be open and affirming to everyone who comes. Sexual behavior is a way that sometimes creates unsafe space. So we have to have the conversations because we still are stuck with our physical plant, right? We still have buildings that only work if we have all of one of the binary genders in this building, and so we'll have all girls over here, all boys over here, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's all safe space, right? So we have a deeper conversation about what we mean by sexual behavior, as opposed to allowing for your expression to be what your expression is. So helping youth sort that out, that we welcome who you are. We ask that you hold those behaviors to spaces outside of camp so that camp can be safe for everyone. So working through that a little bit. So those are kind of new policy things that we do. A policy also around bullying, so that we have a conversation about, so what if somebody looks in a way that I think masculine should look, but they're not, but they might be female or whatever, right? So having those conversations about how are we honoring each other in the space that we are in. So we start with those conversations. However, now we've been thinking about, so how do we offer different space? Because the real practicality is we'd also like to offer physical space for students who don't feel okay being in all male or all female, or however we want to label those, those binary places. So we have two options that we're working on. One we've already done. We've had a cabin that has private bathroom space that we have allowed youth to stay in for a week-long camp. Somebody who just didn't identify as anything near the binary and just exploring in the in-between. And so we have that youth stay in that space. It is big enough that we've also now talked about and are looking at a policy change to create also an all-gender space. And an all-gender space would be for whoever doesn't feel like that binary is anything that they fit on, or that they're exploring there in these different ways of understanding themselves. we have to do that in connection with parents. It's also building that relationship back to parents to say, this can be an option for us, and here's how we will make this safe space, right? So it's working again, both with how do we understand our sexual behavior while we're there, how do we understand bullying, how do we be together, recognizing the holy within one another. That is something that our camp committee is still working on policy-wise, but I think it does help us expand our understanding of why young people still find camp relevant too, when they can find a place that they can connect in. So for us, it's been a really important piece of who we are. We also look at our programming. Our programming is such that we invite youth groups to come together from various churches around the state. They bring a leader or two or three, depending on how many youth come as a group, but we like to invite our students to join other family groups during the week. So we break them all up away from their regular home places so that they have a space to explore, to share, to talk about what they're going through, perhaps differently, or with other people than they normally do at their own church. So somebody may feel more welcomed or free to share something that maybe they haven't been able to do back at home, and still have support from leadership that will help them walk through some of those questions. The other physical piece of that is that providing spaces for youth to gather that are not connected to the sleeping spaces. That's been an issue for us because our buildings were created in an era where that's what you did. You hung out, all the, girls hung out here and all the boys hung out over here, and they had these great lounges, but that separates the group. So we've been working on creating spaces that are not attached to sleeping areas for that hangout time or for small group programming where everyone is welcome to come sit together. That's one of the problems that we have with the space that we would like to make an all-gender space, is that it's separated physically. It's off a little bit away from the main campus. And there isn't a way for us to do this perfectly, but it is a start to think about. So if we know they're going to be staying over there, how do we intentionally program and invite into hangout times that are different, that don't connect themselves to those sleeping spaces? And the last thing I think that is that we have to talk about that has been a huge topic for us is the bathrooms. How do we do bathrooms, and how do we provide safe space there? Our camp is approaching its 60th anniversary. So that's the age of our buildings. They're all 60 years or older because the camp had been a hunting lodge before it became our camp. So our bathrooms are very clearly labeled, either, on the binary, male or female. We only have been able to convert one public bathroom into an all-gender restroom at this point in time. So we've been working with contractors, we've been working with our partner camp, and we've been talking amongst our own camp committee about how can we most feasibly change our bathroom situation so that we have private space or all gender space for people to use. In the sleeping spaces, the biggest sleeping spaces that we do have a proposal to switch everything to a shower, toilet, sink, door. And so each space would be its own private space, all gender accessible. Anyone can use that space because it only fits one person, right? Boom, 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 door. That is wonderful for a lot of our camps. We also have a lot of family camps. So we have to also think about how could we invite a family into that space when it's so small, right? So we're still kind of playing with what that might mean. And there is a cost that is also part of this. However, we feel really committed to figuring it out so that we have a way to invite our youth and anyone who is coming to our camp to feel okay about the bathroom situation. When we have youth and adults on camp, we separate the bathrooms out. These are adult bathrooms, these are youth bathrooms, but they're still basically on the binary, except for the one all gendered that we currently have. But we understand that it's not enough, and we're going to continue to work on that. Our buildings are such that is where we are, but the practicalities are, if we are going to uphold the values that we believe in, then we need to put the dollars toward it and make those changes.
Great. Thank you to each of you for sharing what you shared with the group. I think that there's so many points where your comments all converge, and so many sort of opportunities for us to move forward collectively as a group in conversation. So I'm looking forward. We have about 25 or 22 minutes to have some conversation together. So I'm really excited about that. To the folks that are with us on the webinar, feel free to submit any questions that you may have in the chat box. You also are welcome to raise your hand, and I can call on you, and you would be able to talk as well. So feel free to kind of chime in that way. There's a number of things that I sort of picked up on and was hoping that we could talk about together through some of your comments. One of the things that I would like for us to do is to kind of take a few steps back, because I think that it's very, I think in the communities that we're coming from, it's very frequent that there's sort of a set of terminology that's familiar to us, and a set of even kind of values that we all hold collectively. So I'm wondering if we can take a few steps back, and I'm sure this will be familiar to a lot of people who are on the webinar, but thinking about just getting us all on the same page, thinking about terms that we use a lot, like sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. What are some definitions of those terms that are really helpful for you all, and how do they kind of inform the work that you're doing? And then also there's a few other things that I think are worth getting into. One is we talked a lot about gender transition as well as pronouns. Can you speak to sort of how that's meaningful for you and your everyday work, and sort of what informs your approach to those questions as well? And there's some questions that have already come in, so we've got some more to talk about as well.
Well, I'll take a stab at the first one, which was speaking to the terminology of like, I use the umbrella of sexual identity to include sexual orientation, to include gender identity, and to include gender expression. And so for me, the term sexual orientation is really about who an individual is attracted to, either emotionally, sometimes physically, and maybe romantically, if I had to like lift up and elevate another word. And so again, feeling like we've learned that there may be one or two orientations or three, and as we continue to expand and grow, just knowing that that's about who you're attracted to or what you're attracted to, and in some cases. And then when I think about gender identity, it's like your internal sense of, for some, the binary, like Laurie offered up, because we're socialized in that way. And kind of seeping into what I would say in your second question, but I do think a lot of this is about how we're socialized, first through our parents and then through our life experiences. And so some things we have to unlearn, or there's new information that we have to take in and filter it out, and understanding that this is a lifespan experience, and how we see ourselves today, who we're attracted to today, how we express ourselves today to other people can change over as we grow older and go through our life. And so that's part of that socialization process. Yeah, I kind of lost my other piece, but I just wanted to elevate
That's
at least
great.
that.
I have more to say about that too. So each camper creates a name tag, and we ask them to put their preferred pronouns on their name tag, so that this is a part of how we continue to learn how to address one another. And we include that in a group agreement that we do, the oops, ouch, like, oops, no, remember, this is what my pronoun is. But, and own it and say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, and how do we have those conversations if somebody does, kind of tread on the wrong foot with that? We work with them to help understand, yes, this is who I'm identifying as. It just helps, again, build better relationship, but it also expands understanding of what someone is actually working on.
Yeah, definitely. Did you have anything to add, Cantina?
No, I didn't. I think Laurie and Tanya did a great job of the definitions there. So yes.
Great. Yeah, and I think so too. Thank you so much. I do want to lift up one thing that we didn't touch on, but I think that a lot of young people are really experiencing right now, is that and I guess, Laurie, you spoke to this some in your comments, but there are some people who, identify as agender or identify as asexual, right? And so those are people who may not experience sexual attraction at all, or may not experience sexual attraction to the level in a strong way. And then agender people who don't identify with a particular gender identity or a stable gender identity. And I think that sort of leads into one of the questions Elizabeth asks. Do you have any suggestions for training materials for counselors surrounding all of the topics that we've been discussing? So Tanya shared the lesson plans from the Center for Sex Ed. Yes, that's a great book. We have that in their offices as well. But I'm wondering if there are other things that you all would lift up within the context of camp, but also within the broader conversations we've been having. And just make sure to unmute yourself.
I would recommend, it depends on if you've been in a place where you've had an opportunity to work with Our Whole Lives, the sexuality curriculum. That has been so helpful within the Minnesota Conference, because we also host camps that are based off of the Our Whole Lives workshops. And so it helps everybody kind of get on the same page with the language that we are using. But I would say there are helpful things within that curriculum that could even help just for training, especially the piece about the identity and attraction and orientation, those various things. Plus, CCUS has their book, not exactly the most exciting for training youth who are working with kids at camp, but there are a few things out there. I haven't seen a whole lot. We created our own. Because we realized there was a lack of information out there. So we based some of our training on the Faith Trust Institute Safe Church Policies, Safe Church Trainings, and geared it toward faith formation and working with young people at camp, just so that we could begin to get those who do support us at camp, especially those adults and those group leaders that come with our youth, to be having those conversations and to help them move into the ways that are the healthiest ways to create relationship while we're there.
Great.
I would also plug the workbook that Tanya showed. I went to a training at Temple Harrisburg a month or so ago on that book with Tracy Gilbert and others who who had authored or co-authored the book. And I believe that Marie's training, a couple of hers, or at least one of hers, Marie is our CEO here at the Religious Institute, I think it's the bisexuality training, which is a really, really good training. I've presented it in different contexts and spaces, and it's a great training for people to really have an idea or get a better idea about the difference between attraction and behavior. Because I think a lot of times folks hear the word bisexuality and they're like, you know, they think one thing in their head, and it's actually a lot more complex than that. And so I just wanted to plug that book again. There's lots of fun activities in there. There's all sorts of different levels as far as, you know, the kind of starting knowledge base that people might be coming from who are doing those trainings. And so I do think it's a great tool to use with staff if you're trying to help them to get some basic and not so basic, because there are some higher level trainings in there related to sexual orientation, gender identity, etc.
Definitely.
And I was just going to add, like, I put in the chat box a few other trainings and or resources, and some of those resources are specifically for young people, but I feel like he who teaches learns, and so you can also look at those videos and learn for yourself as an adult, but then it could also be a resource for staff, and then not to break away from the schedule of responses, but Amaze has really good information for parents as well.
Great. Yeah, and I think that what Tanya, you were just pointing to is that there was a question. There's another question about sort of resources and best practices. So I'll just read the question. It's from Carol. Carol says, what would you say are best practices when dealing with parents that may not be as comfortable with their children using this time away to explore who they may be as an individual?
I think that Laurie brought up some really good points when she talked about the policies that they have in place at camp related to you know, making sure that kids or that young people know that their attractions are not bad or shameful in any way, but how are we acting on those or not acting on those in a camp setting? Because what you may or may not do at home may be different than what you know, think you can be doing at camp, and vice versa, and all of the kind of mechanisms that go into place with that. I think that, you know, parents, it's a difficult conversation, but I think that parents have to have the conversation with their kids about, back to what I was saying earlier about ethical decision making. Like, you are probably not developmentally at a space and place in your life where you need to be making decisions about engaging in XYZ activities. And let's talk about why. Let's talk about all of the things that should be, all of the variables that should be factoring in when you are making a decision to enter into a physical or sexual relationship with somebody else. Two, you know, there's a time and place for everything, and camp is not that place, right? And so, you know, again, what people may be kind of working through on their own home turf is a completely different, may or may not be a completely different set of variables happening at camp. Just like you wouldn't engage in certain activities at school or at church or you know, other places that have particular rules and regulations in place. It's the same thing for camp. And so I think that is you know, a behavioral conversation that young people or that parents need to be having with their young people, regardless, when they're sending them off somewhere, about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And you know, what consequences can come out of, you know, engaging in inappropriate behavior in a place where that is not sort of a part of the program. So yeah, I think that's a starting place. as far as sexual expression is concerned, where parents can start to have that kind of conversation.
I guess to sort of follow up with that, and I'm wondering if everyone could reflect on this. What do you do in the context, though, when maybe the parents are not as open-minded, or maybe they're even openly hostile, right? So the kid is living in a family context where they can't express their sexual orientation or gender identity, but they come to camp and those restrictions aren't there because the parents aren't there, right? And so the parents want to sort of police or dictate what the child's expression is going to be at camp as well, and want to sort of loop in you as the camp director and your staff as camp counselors in that project. How do you kind of respond in that scenario?
I'm going to think off the fly on this one. Sure. Because I haven't had that happen. But I wonder if it is one of those conversations to, ask the family, what is your value around this? What is your family value around sexuality? What is it that is scaring you about this? What is it that you maybe just don't know or understand about what your child is going through? And how can we support you in ways that allows your youth to still be in a space where they feel okay to explore those things? I think that's those are conversations probably best held at the local level, mm-hmm. with their local clergy, with their local folks, better than with the camp director, because I don't know them as well. I get to know the camper, but I almost never get to know the families, right? Mm-hmm. So I just get to know on that camper end. I do want to reiterate what Cantina said, though, too, about just that piece of being safe in what, sexual behavior is, being clear about what sexual behavior is, because sometimes kids don't know what that is either. And so we have to, I see heads nodding, yes, because they don't sometimes know that that's sexual behavior. So having a really frank conversation and allowing families to know that we will be having those conversations with campers as well. That's really important, so that they understand that when they are bringing their young people to us, that we are going to have that conversation, but we're also going to be providing appropriate leadership throughout the camp, that we have eyes on what's going on. We work in shifts. We have people that are helping to watch what's going on, so we can catch those behaviors, or we can talk about them, and again, in a non-shaming way, but say, hey, where'd that come from? Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about why, helping to walk through that with them. And I think maybe those would be ways that I would talk with families who might not be so thrilled about this opportunity to explore, to say, hey, we are also providing an environment that is also being monitored.
Right. Yeah. And I think that relates to a question that I sort of have about camp in general, which it reminds me of This American Life did a series on camp, which they sometimes will replay. And it sort of talks about camp as this kind of liminal space, right? As a space that is outside of your regular life, and there are all these new possibilities and experiences, and you are exploring parts of yourself, and you learn about new things about yourself. And I'm wondering sort of what are some best practices or practices that have been helpful for you, whether as parents or consultants or as camp counselors or camp directors, in terms of moving campers from that sort of liminal space back into their everyday lives, particularly if it maybe has been a space where they've thought about sexual ethics in a different way, or thought about sexual expression or gender identity in a different way. How do you kind of care for them as they move into the sort of post-liminal of their day-to-day?
I don't mean to hog all the time, but we do this very intentionally, because we understand that camp is an intense time together. So typically our camps start on Sunday and they end on Friday morning. So we use that Wednesday night going into Thursday, we use Thursday as that transition time. So all of our programming is, okay, here's what we've done this week. Now, what will it look like when you leave here? How do we carry forward not only some of the, the real things that we learned, but how do we carry what we felt in our heart beyond this space? How do we help those things that transformed us, right? Because if we're not having a transformative experience, then what's happening at camp, right? We hope that they do have one of those experiences, but how do we use that as we move out? So we incorporate that into our programming and use self-reflection and use theological reflection in that last day to help move them through that transition of understanding themselves as who they may be when they leave on Friday morning, and understanding their friends as they part ways, or maybe perhaps the whole next year they won't see each other, but they made these deep relationships. And with social media, they all talk. They're really a connected group of kids by the end of the week most of the time.
Thanks. All right, I just wanted to leave some space there to see if anyone else had anything to add. So thank you so much for this time. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I want to leave us with your final thoughts and let you all have the last word. And the way that I'd like to frame this is similar to a way that we ask a question of scholars in a series that we do called the Seminary Spotlight. And we ask the scholars, what is one thing that you wish that seminary students knew about sex, sexuality, sexual identity? So I'm going to ask you all that question, but instead of students, I'm going to replace that with camp counselors. So what is one thing that you wish that camp counselors knew about sexual identity, gender expression in the course of their work?
I'll go first again.
Great.
I take advantage of the B last name. Sorry, Laurie, I know you have an A last name. But I wish that they would understand that sexuality is complex, and how we identify is fluid and ever-changing, and that it's not just about young people, and hoping that in their understanding some of their campers, that they also will understand themselves too. It's almost like sometimes I forget, I think adults or older youth or just really young adults forget what the experiences was like, and that we're still all ever evolving. So I hope that they know that this is an ever evolving personal experience.
Well, Tanya hit the nail right on the head there, because I was going to say that the thing that I wished that counselors knew or remembered, particularly for the ones that are a little bit older, was that they were too tweens and teens at one point in their lives. And if they just took a moment to go back down memory lane and to understand all of the ways that they might have felt awkward or unsure or didn't really know, which way to go related to the changes that were happening in their bodies and in their minds, that they, and perhaps they didn't have a compassionate person to talk to about that, or who didn't shame them related to that. And so I would say I wish that all camp counselors knew how to talk to young people, or how to respond to young people in their care with affirmation and not shame, and with patience and with direct communication. How we try to talk to children in general. It gets a little different as they get older, but still sort of being direct and honest with them. And just to remember what it was like for them, and maybe do a little bit better.
Great. Thanks.
I agree so much with what Tanya and Cantina said. Absolutely. I wish that counselors would remember also that there is 7 billion different ways in which we express who we are. We are all just uniquely ourselves. And to hold that dear, if they hold that dear for themselves, then hold that dear for the person in front of them too. And allow for whatever magic can come from those relationships, from human to human to human.
Great. I think that's a perfect note for us to end on. Thank you all so much for your time, and hope that everyone has a great camp season and a lovely day. Thanks again.